Can we start? Okay. My name is Caterina Battello, and I will be moderating this seminar. This seminar is organized by Agroecology Europe due to celebrate the month of agroecology. And for once, we change a bit the focus. We don't speak so much about the production, agroecology and production, but we focus on the entire food system, so rather at the end of the food system. For your information, the seminar is posted on the chat, and you can also see it from the website, from social media. So if you don't see it all, you can go back and download it later on from Agroecology website, but it will be very interesting to stay until the end, because the idea is to have three very important, relevant speakers that will complement each other. Each will have a presentation, reply to some questions from you, and then we will have a roundtable around some very burning issues for the remaining 30 minutes. So I would advise to stay. It will be interesting. For your information, the next seminar will take place on the 8th of November and will be on nutritional benefits of agroecological diets. So you might be interested in the following webinar as well. So we organized the speakers. The first speakers will be Nick Jacobs. He is the director of IPES-Food, and he's a specialist in agri-food trade and development policy. And he has a background in media communication and political research. He was also a member of the support team to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter. So he will present the IPES report, Meat and Protein, the Politics of Protein. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Caterina, and thank you to Agroecology Europe for organizing this webinar on a really important topic. The report whose conclusions I'll be presenting is called The Politics of Protein, as mentioned by Caterina, and this is a report that IPES-Food published last year, in which we really analyzed this huge area of debate and discussion around meat and protein. And I think it's worth noting that, following the release of this report, we've been conducting roundtable discussions in Europe, Africa. We're going to be holding another one at COP27 in a couple of weeks' time. So the report was very much the start of a discussion rather than the end point of that discussion. Just waiting for the slides to load, and happy to move forward. I don't believe the slides are visible yet. There we are. Thank you, Elena. Voilà. Great. So if we could move to this slide. Thank you. Perfect. First of all, why did we write this report? Well, the starting point is that the state of play globally on meat and livestock is not an option. We can't stand still. I'm not going to go into lots of detail. I think everyone is very familiar with the data now on this, at least everyone on this call and people paying attention to this topic. A couple of key data points, though, to reiterate why this is such a crucial sector to reform. Up to 80% of land globally is used for the production of livestock, either directly or for the production of feed that goes into those systems. Sorry, 80% of farmland, I should say. So that's a huge amount of land, and it's very difficult to see how we can meet sustainability goals while so much land is being used for this one specific sector. Another lesser known data point, 60% of infectious diseases globally are caused by pathogens that are shared with animals. So these are diseases that can spread very easily from industrial meat production out into the rest of society. And we've seen with recent pandemics such as COVID, the links between agriculture and diseases affecting human beings are very present and very concerning. And another reason why this is such a crucial question to look at is that meat and dairy consumption has changed massively over the last 40 years. we're on a very dangerous trend line where we've seen meat and dairy consumption double since the 1960s, mostly due to consumption trends in the global north. So this is a trend line that, you know, if it were to continue, would be hugely problematic, and it already is. But what we found in working on this topic is that just as important as making that statement about the unsustainability of this sector is to the importance of stating that not all livestock systems are equal. And in fact, the way forward is very complex. When we think about how vast this sector is that we're talking about a sector that has 1.7 billion small-scale farmers in the global south. We're talking about more than 50% of EU farms that hold animals on some scale. So, you know, we're often talking about a protein transition, but from what starting point to what end goal? There's so many questions there that we sometimes forget to ask. And we found that, you know, this is an area where there are bold and simplistic claims which are really driving the debate and actually polarizing the debate further, because they start from assumptions. We fail to agree the basic terms and boundaries of what we're discussing. So through this report, we wanted to really unpack those claims. We could move to the next slide. So we found that there are 8 key claims that are being made by powerful actors, agribusinesses, governments, international institutions, investors, big civil society groups as well. Claims that are really setting the terms of debate and driving the responses to the problems in meat, livestock, and all animal source food production. The first claim that we looked at is the claim that we need more protein to meet the needs of a growing population. Claim 2, also about the problems. Eating red meat is bad for your health. Claim 3, the environmental problems. Livestock production is incompatible with climate sustainability goals. Claim 4 is a different type of claim. It's really about the barriers to transformation. This assumption that eating meat, dairy, and fish is a part of who we are. So this claim about food culture and the role of meat in food culture. Then on the right are claims that guide our responses, claims about the solutions we need. So we often hear alternative proteins are a win-win-win for animals, people, and the planet. We hear that in different forms. The next claim, we need aquaculture to be increased and scaled up to meet our protein needs. Claim 7 is about techno-fixes. Technological advances can rapidly reduce the negative impacts of livestock. And the final claim that we singled out was about regenerative livestock. So a different kind of pathway forward, where we hear that we're told regenerative livestock systems can solve environmental problems like climate change and soil degradation. So these are 8 claims of the many claims that are shaping this debate. I think it's worth saying up front that these are not myths. They're not myths that we're trying to debunk. They're not always false, but they are ways of organizing the discussion that are sometimes emphasizing certain parts and putting other things outside the frame. And you know, if you look on the left here, why are claims important? Claims are about how we interpret the evidence. And this is an area with a vast array of data, new studies being presented all the time. And the claims that we hear are ways of organizing that evidence. Claims emphasize specific problems and solutions. So if we're told that technologies can solve the problem, that is going to be putting less emphasis and leaving less space for other ways of solving problems. Completely different pathways based on organizational innovation, social innovation, deep behavioral change, right? Claims also set the boundaries for discussion in fairly important ways. And I think if the starting point for a discussion on meat and livestock is that global land use can be optimized for biodiversity preservation, for greenhouse gas mitigation, people can be shifted off the land, shifted into other sectors. If those are the boundaries and the starting points, then we're going to be looking at specific, more technological solutions, substitution-based solutions. if the starting point is a different one, if we assume from the very beginning that we have to find solutions that keep small-scale farmers on the land, that preserve traditional diets, revive those diets and agro-biodiverse farming systems that came with them, then it's a completely different discussion and we're looking at different pathways forward. So we wanted to unpack that and really illustrate what the impact is of these claims and look at different ways of approaching this discussion, really resetting it. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail on some of these claims. If we could move to the next slide. So one of the really foundational claims, and one of the things we hear most often in this debate, is that we need more protein. We need more protein to meet the needs of a growing population. And we've got a specific quote here from Tyson Foods. By 2050, global food systems will need to double protein production to meet the needs of almost 10 billion people. So these claims about protein are extremely prominent. We see through this claim by Tyson that protein is being effectively used as a synonym for food security. We need more protein to get to food security. And this goes back a long way in history. There was a lot of discussion of protein gaps in some of the early work by nutritionists in Africa, through colonial approaches to nutrition development in sub-Saharan Africa. There was a lot of emphasis on closing protein gaps, ensuring therapeutic products that were protein rich to get to populations there. Over time, that has been partly debunked, and I think there's been a realization that people have poor diets for a number of reasons, primarily a lack of income, meaning a lack of access to a diverse diet with a range of micronutrients. And protein deficiency is real and it's present in some populations, but it's often there alongside many other deficiencies. Calcium, vitamin D, for example. And so I think if the emphasis is on protein, as the narrative often places that emphasis, then we're looking to solve that problem. And we look again to protein-centered interventions rather than thinking about changing the whole food system and addressing these fundamental kind of root causes of poor diets. And of course, if we look in a global north context, I think that there's agreement that there's overconsumption of meat and dairy. If we're looking through a protein lens, then we'll look first to alternative proteins to replace that meat and dairy, when in reality, people in the global north very rarely have protein deficiencies, and reducing their meat and dairy consumption could be done without having to substitute in another protein-rich product in the center of the plate. It can be done as part of a diverse, very healthy plant-based diet, or a diet including some amount of animal source foods. So these are some of the issues with this claim, which has been prominent for decades and is becoming increasingly prominent again with this focus on protein transition and alternative proteins. So if we move to the next slide, here are two very foundational claims, again, about the problems that we're trying to solve. We often hear that eating meat is bad for your health, particularly red meat. We're told that livestock production is incompatible with climate sustainability goals. The first thing to say here is, well, there are two key things to say. Firstly, these are essentially true. There's lots of evidence in favor of these claims. Secondly, a lot of the discourse in reality is more nuanced. And here we're taking some more extreme examples. We do hear, for example, the CEO of Impossible Foods, the manufacturer of the Impossible Burger, saying that livestock is the most destructive technology on earth, and shifting to plant-based substitutes is the only way to save the world. So that's a more extreme version. But reassuringly, a lot of the discourse is more nuanced, particularly in the European policy context. And we see many groups kind of singling out industrial livestock as the livestock model that is essentially incompatible with climate goals and has this range of negative impacts. And that's indeed very well evidenced. So, when we looked at these claims, I think there is a lot of evidence in favor of them, particularly when we narrow in on industrial livestock, industrial feedlots, and the particular dynamics of those systems. But again, there's nuance in terms of different regional production systems, and that's sometimes lost in the discussion. And, you know, we think very important to underline that there are small-scale livestock systems that can be multifunctional. In many parts of the world, you know, these are systems that don't just provide meat, they might be providing hides, wool, traction, they provide collateral for farmers who will have difficulty accessing credit otherwise. They help to fertilize soils, and often livestock systems are in fact an efficient use of marginal land and a better use of that land than other realistic uses of it, more resource efficient use. And those are factors that are often sort of sidelined in the discussion when our lens is about meat, livestock as the problem, looking for alternative ways to get protein, more protein for less greenhouse gases. That's a discussion that doesn't leave space for considering that multifunctionality. It's a different set of metrics, a different set of considerations that are placed kind of outside the frame. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Here, a very different claim I'll go into briefly for the sake of time. Eating meat, dairy, and fish is part of who we are. It's part of our food cultures. This is something so foundational to the debate on protein transition. And for many actors in this debate, I think there's an assumption that food cultures can't really change. They're stuck where they are. We're stuck with this very high meat and dairy consumption in Europe. If anything, it's just going to get worse. It's going to be replicated elsewhere. And therefore, the only way to change that is through some form of substitution, like alternative proteins, where we don't really have to change our habits more fundamentally. The only way to change is something that really looks, tastes, feels exactly like meat. And here, when you look at the evidence, there's certainly plenty of evidence globally of kind of food cultural norms where animal source foods are central. And that's, you know, festivities, celebrations, really a part of everyday life in all world regions. But it's just as true that food cultures can change, and they have changed historically in a number of ways. And perhaps what's overlooked is that there are many actors who are influencing those shifts in food culture quite deliberately. And that includes kind of policy imperatives and the role of the food industry, particularly through marketing and lobbying efforts. And if we think about the historical surpluses we've had of dairy in Europe, for example, that is a situation that has led to those products being incentivized through public policies, and it's led to artificially cheap prices. And these things have influenced the consumer trends that we're now seeing as something kind of immovable. The food industry has also been very good at cementing our idea of what is food culture, and the idea that, for example, in the US, that Thanksgiving is a time when you eat turkey. This is partly because of the role of the food industry telling people that that's what it is. There's also lots of interesting literature on meat and masculinity, and the ways in which industry marketing has reinforced this idea that to be a man, you need to eat red meat. And there's even the concept of female foods that's been propagated through marketing as well. So the key point here is that food culture is something much more fluid than it seems to be. Current food cultures in the global north are fairly meat-centric, but that's not something that necessarily needs to stay the same. And these cultures are only inevitable insofar as industrial agriculture and the current food industry are inevitable. And we hope that, you know, by unpacking this claim, we can see the potential for some broader dietary changes and behavioral changes that are maybe kept off the table through some of the discussion. The final set of claims I wanted to just delve into very quickly on the next slide. There's a lot going on here. These are essentially 3 different claims that are about kind of silver bullet solutions, ways that we can keep our diets essentially without big behavioral changes, without big changes in the way that food and agriculture are organized. One of these is through alternative proteins. So that's, lab-grown meat, also plant-based substitutes like Impossible Burger. We hear very vocal claims about aquaculture as the solution to get more protein for less greenhouse gases and something that can be upscaled quite rapidly. And we hear about techno fixes that can make livestock in its more industrial forms much more sustainable. And here, when we unpack these claims, we see a lot of misleading information. We see a lot of assumptions and really a very narrow lens again. And, particularly with the techno fixes for industrial livestock, these are solutions that are designed to work at scale, but so often scale is the problem. If we think about anaerobic digesters for methane, these are systems that cost maybe $3 to $5 million being promoted in the US in particular, but it's only the largest farms that can afford these technologies. So this is going to be something that reinforces this pressure to upscale, to have these large concentrated livestock farms, and that is the root cause of so many problems, particularly the spread of diseases. These are solutions that reinforce the food industry and its power. It reinforces agribusinesses, and that's true even in the alternative protein sector, which started as a real boom of startups, but in which we see the large meat and dairy firms increasingly buying up the alternative protein companies and rolling out their own meat-free product lines. So essentially, these are claims that equate protein transition with disruptive innovation, but in doing so, they disregard and I think downplay the potential for more transformative changes in diets, in the food environment surrounding us, in food cultures. If we could go to the final slide. I had more on alternative proteins, but I think we'll skip that for now and might come back to it later. Just to finish off and try to keep to time, if we could go a bit further forward to the final slide. One more, thank you. The way forward. Other speakers are going to go into a lot more detail on what can be done in Europe to advance the protein transition. We deliberately didn't make very, very precise recommendations in this report because one of the key messages is that it depends, and there are so many regional differences and differences along the spectrum of livestock production, fisheries, aquaculture production as well, that we want to be really careful not to generalize. That said, in Europe and other global north regions, I think it's pretty clear that we do need a shift towards less and better meat and dairy production. This is a framing that's used by a number of civil society groups and is probably as good as we can do as a kind of umbrella for the type of transformation we need. I think the key insight we have on the way forward is that the most important things we need to do are really about the big picture. We're not going to get the protein transition we want just by focusing on regulating industrial livestock or changing kind of cap subsidies, whether they're coupled or decoupled. These things are important, and regulating industrial feedlots is certainly part of the solution. But we think the most crucial thing is to kind of get the big picture right and to address meat and livestock as part of this broader transition to sustainable food systems. So that means, getting the right priorities. That means, for example, agricultural subsidies and research funding being channeled towards agroecological transformation, not going to alternative proteins. And we see increasingly governments looking at supporting that sector, but we think, there's a huge opportunity cost, and this is precious public funding that needs to be going to public goods and this broader transformation that's needed. We need to get the incentives right. And again, another kind of really big leverage point is improving our food environments. So all of the incentives we see around us, the environments we live in, from schools through to workplaces, through to the neighborhoods we live in, and which options are most affordable, most accessible to people. If we get that right, I think we'll get that shift in consumption away from this excessive meat and dairy consumption we see now. And we'll be able to do that without penalizing small-scale livestock farmers, in fact, with benefits for them, with these incentives, allowing people to access that food. And we need to get the right governance. That's crucial. IPES-Food has proposed a common food policy for Europe, and we have now a farm-to-fork strategy that's being developed that's got the comprehensive vision that we need to move forward. But when it comes to meat and livestock, territorial governance is really important as part of that comprehensive multi-level governance. And when we look at meat and livestock through a territorial lens, I think we really then can prioritize circularity, resource efficiency at the scale where it really makes sense. And that will help us to get the right incentives for sustainable livestock to benefit, and to remove the incentives for the more industrial model. So I will stop there. Apologies for going slightly over time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. You went over time, but your presentation was so dense and you were resetting the debate. So it's a lot of, I think people will have to go back and rewatch it because there was so much in it. So as I said before, we have time for maybe one burning question. And then we pass to the next speaker, which will be Morgan Oddy. And then at the end of the three speakers, we will have time for more questions and the debate. So I see one question on circularity, which was part of your recommendations. We hear a lot about speaking circular economy. In a nutshell, what would be concrete so that we can better understand the meaning of circularity for moving towards different food systems?
Thank you. I think the most concrete example is having mixed crop and livestock systems. And so many of the problems we have today are because they've been separated, right? When it comes to recycling waste, nutrient flows. So mixed crop livestock systems are something that are inherently circular. Crops can be fed to animals, waste from animals can be used to fertilize soil. So that is a circular system which minimizes the amount of things you have to import from outside the system with major, that come with externalities and big environmental impacts, and make sure that that system is sustainable in that it reuses the byproducts rather than them having to be someone else's problem.
Thank you, Nick. I can see also a very important point for you, Nick, on the chat. Maybe I suggest you check it and we move to the next speaker, which is Morgan Oddy. Morgan Oddy is a French farmer, is a vegetable grower in Brittany, and she's also the general coordinator for Europe of La Via Campesina. And she will present the vision for an agroecological transition of the system. So Morgan, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon to all. Yes, so I will start by talking about the contrary of agroecology, because I think that one can only understand what we mean by agroecology if we put it in comparison with what is industrial agriculture and how it developed. Over millenniums, farming has been about working with nature to ensure fertility. It has been about ensuring positive synergies between different plants, animal species to produce food and all the things that the people were needed for their livelihood. And there is a kind of magic in fertility, because through the synergy between the sun, the rain, the animal manure, the grass, the rocks, and human work and intelligence, a peasant of land can produce more and better food, but also wood, medical plants, and beautiful landscapes. And the modernization of agriculture has been about transforming farming into an activity very similar to industry. And this is the reason why we talk about the industrialization of agriculture. The industry does not work with living beings. Industrial activity is about transforming dead, non-living inputs into outputs. And so does modern agriculture. So I will try to briefly describe 3 typical modern industrial farms in order to be better understood. For example, a typical grain farm in eastern France would have around 400 hectares, or a lot more, can be as well, of wheat monoculture, and at the best rotating with 2 different crops like rapeseed or barley. And in order to grow, these monocultures need to be fertilized with the use of huge quantities of synthetic fertilizers like ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, or potassium sulfate. Yeah, no need to say that on such a farm, there will be a single farmer, only one person working there. And their farming is seen as a pure chemistry, transforming NPK into biomass. All other elements of the ecosystem will be considered as negative, competing with the monoculture. So they will be destroyed through pesticides or herbicides. And the harvest made of straw and grain, if we talk of wheat, will be fully taken away from the ecosystem. Even if factually the farmers works on the land is considered as a mere space, not as a living area or ecosystem. All this process requires a huge quantity of oil, both for the mechanization and for the synthetic inputs, which are almost all byproducts of the petroleum industry. So for this reason, we often say that modern agriculture is about transforming petrol into food. On the other side, you will find industrial livestock factory farms. These farms, most of the time, they have no land, or only the land on which the livestock housing is built. 99% of them, at least in France, they are under contract with an agribusiness company or cooperative such as Sanders or LDC in France, or for example, Danish Krone in Denmark. And these companies provide the farmers with all the inputs, the small animals, the animal feeding stuff, the antibiotics, and other treatments. So if you look at where this production takes place in Europe, you will see that it's mainly near the coast, in Bretagne, that's where I live, in Flanders, Denmark, Netherlands, because most of the animal feeding stuff is imported and gets in Europe in cargo ships. When the animals are big enough, these companies take them out of the farm to the slaughterhouses, and then the meat and other animal side products are sold throughout the world. Here again, the farmer does not really produce anything. He is there only to ensure the transformation of inputs, the feeding, into animal ore. Just like the land, the animal is considered as a mere tool where this transformation takes place. The feeding stuff is transformed into meat through the animal. But he is not considered as a living animal. He is considered as a machine. And in this system, the manure becomes a negative externality, an output that the farmer needs to get rid of the cheapest possible way. And my last example is an industrial vegetable farm. For example, in tomato production. Tomato is typically a Mediterranean vegetable, yet there is a huge production of tomato in the Netherlands, North Germany, and Bretagne, in very northern area with not so much sun. And so this production is fully artificialized. The tomato plant grows in hydroponic without soil. The plant is fed with synthetic NPK, which is added up to the water system. And in winter and on spring, the greenhouses are heated and lit up artificially with imported gas. So once again, we can say that the main input for tomato is oil. All what these three farms produce are raw material to be processed by the industry. And this is something important. These farms do not produce food. They produce raw material. And it's only after the process by the agro-industry that you have food that is sold in the supermarkets. I think that this is something also that needs to be noted. So these are the principles of industrial agriculture. High level of specialization, including territorial specialization, linked with transport of agricultural commodities throughout the world. Second is high dependence towards imported inputs. The third one is the need to deal with huge negative outputs and externalities, such as the pollutions or the manure, which in industrial livestock production is considered is really a negative externality. The fourth specification is a huge energy consumption. 5 is a very high productivity of work, but which means very few workers, very few farmers. And 6 is the production of raw material, not food, and the need of these raw materials to be processed. So to be brief, the modernization of agriculture has been about replacing the energy of human and animal work by fossil fuel. It has been about replacing the peasants by the machines. It has been about destroying local autonomous food systems based on billions of peasants by a globalized food system controlled by a handful of transnational corporations. It has been about changing agriculture from a work to ensure fertility to an extractivist activity. And I find it interesting to listen to the vocabulary used in agriculture. I'm French, so I know more the French wordings. So, and it's very obvious in French. For example, the word peasant, paysan, means a person who is anchored in a territory, and it's also related to peace. It has the same roots as peace. And now the official denomination for a farmer in France is exploitant agricole. It has to do with exploitation. And a farm is an exploitation agricole. Meat has become animal ore. So the vocabulary has become the one of mining activities, just as if we were not working with living beings, but with objects or rocks or commodities. So I think that this very long introduction was necessary to explain what is agroecology. Agroecology is not a set of techniques. It is really about how human societies relate to ecosystem to fulfill our needs, not only the food, but also all the needs and also the cultural and spiritual needs that we have as human societies. And agroecology is about fertility. What a peasant does is to study and to implement the best possible synergies between the piece of land where she or he works, the sunlight, the rain, the season, the animals that live in the soil, and those who are our working partners on the farm, the insects, the diversity of trees and plants surrounding us. And through these synergies, and this we encompasses not only the human beings, but all beings, we produce food and beauty. So agroecology is interestingly based on territories. We as peasants, we try to use the resources available on our territories and we consider each and every output as a possible input to be reused on the farm. We try to use as little imported inputs as possible and to generate as little negative externality as possible. The main source of energy in agroecological production is the sun and the photosynthesis. For this reason, we work with the seasons. As we try to make the best use of the synergies between a huge diversity of elements on agroecological farms, it's as Nick was saying, it's almost always a mixed farms with a diversity of crops and animal breedings. We use the manure of animals to fertilize the fields. We grow some cereals, crops, to produce grain on straw, and part of the vegetable harvest goes to feed the animal, and the straw is used as a litter for the animals. Those who transform milk into cheese on farm give the lactose serum to feed the pigs, and some crops residues go to feed the barnyard. Mixing animal breedings and crop production is absolutely central in agroecology because this is how we nourish fertility. It is a little joke, but my father told me, I am the daughter of a dairy farmer, and he told me that a cow is so much more efficient than any tractor, because no tractor has both a front cutter bar and a rear manure spreader. It does not exist, but the cow does this every day when it is on the grass. And another important thing to say is that agroecology is always a collective work. A single farmer alone can never implement agroecology. And I tell this from experience. I am alone on my farm, and I see really the limits in it. I am an organic farmer, and this is okay. But to be really good as an agroecological peasant, it is something that I cannot achieve alone. I need to work with colleagues, and I'm very happy because still in my area, we are quite a lot of farmers, but we need to be a lot of farmers to implement agroecology. I think that this is the main message that we have from the European coordination by Campesina. No agroecology is possible without many farmers. And this is also something that I learned very early when I started to farm. Is an old neighbor told me that when most of the people around him were farmers, he could be a peasant. But when it's only 2% of the people who are farming, then we are forced to become agribusinessmen, exploitants agricoles, because we need to exploit the soil, the animals, most of the time our family, and ourselves in order to be able to produce enough food to feed all the others who are not farming. So most of ECVC's proposal in order to ensure a transition towards agroecology are really based on the necessity to have more farmers. And I think that sometimes, you know, people, it can seem like an utopia, but we need to remember that all over the world, most of the societies have a great number of small-scale farmers. The countries where there are only 2% of farmers, it's an exception. It's only about Western Europe, the US, Canada, very few countries actually. Even if you look at Eastern Europe and at Southern Europe, the great majority of farms are still small. There are many farmers, and these farms are mixed farms, which are really implementing agroecology on a day-to-day basis. So what we want is to support these farmers, which are still a lot in Europe, and they are receiving no support, no cap subsidy, no fair prices. They really struggle just to get a piece of land. So we need support for all these farmers. And in countries where industrial agriculture has replaced, in most of the territories, peasant farming and agroecology, we need to make sure that many more people can start farming. Because me alone on my farm, I cannot do agroecology. Agroecology is about it's a project for society. It's not about an individual thing that you say, oh, now I will start doing agroecology. No, you can do agroecology only if you have a community with you. And so I will stop here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Morgan, for your wonderful presentation that also complements a lot the policy vision of Nicolas and goes much closer to people, to farmers, to our daily life. As a comment says, agroecology is a political act. And you also highlighted the importance of solidarity among all farmers. There is time for questions. If you want to place questions on the chat, you are welcome. I would start with one question that also follows what Nick started. He spoke about mixed livestock crop systems that promote circularity. So you also spoke about raising livestock on grasslands and having always animals into your cropping diversified systems. In a specialized type of agriculture and in a European system of subsidies, what would be a burning policy recommendation for enhancing this circularity, this inclusion of animals into more diversified cropping system based on people and farmers? What would be your political recommendation if you could be free to dream? Let's put it like that.
The fact that now the common agricultural policy is mainly based on distributing subsidies, it does not work for agroecology. We need to be very clear on this. First, because the subsidies are distributed depending the size of your farm. So the bigger your farm is, the more subsidies you get. And also, the more specialized you are, the more subsidies you get. So it's a completely perverse system for agroecology. And what we ask, we need a common agricultural policy. So we want a CAP and we want a common agricultural and food policy, but we want it to be based on fair prices for the farmers, because all farms in agroecology, they produce huge value. The fact that we have a diversity of crops, of animals, and of high quality products, we are able to produce really great things, but we need to be able to sell them at fair prices. This is the key. Small farmers in Europe already, we do not receive subsidies. I do not, my farm is 1.3 hectares. I do not receive subsidies. The best way that we can help small-scale farmers to make a fair living is by ensuring fair prices, prices which are stable and which are over the cost of production. And for this, we need market regulation. This is what we need from a common agricultural policy. And we know that this is possible. First, because CAP used to be about market regulation. It had a lot of problems, but we know that we can do it. And also, we know that in other countries like India, they have a public policy based on market regulation, which is ensuring, it's not perfect neither, but it's ensuring that most of the small-scale farmers, they can still make a livelihood. And so this is what we really need if we want to. It's not the only condition to move towards agroecology, but we cannot move towards agroecology if we don't have fair prices for the farmers. Because even if many young people would love to become farmers, I know so many young people who would love it. But if you cannot make a living out of farming, you cannot do it. So ensuring that you can make a living out of farming, it is really one of the key. Yeah, thanks.
Super. This is also very interesting. And this is how also agriculture functions in many other countries. As you were saying, in Africa, there are no subsidies. And so in ensuring the fair price for the production is vital to maintain the farmers productive and in a decent way on their farms is all what they want. But if they don't get the right prices, they are also forced to to go away and to stop working. So thanks a lot, Morgan, for the moment. Don't go away. There will be a debate among the three of you. And now, last but not least, Xavier Poux. Xavier is a research associate at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, called IDDRI. You know it as IDDRI. He is also an agricultural system expert and public decision in agricultural development and environmental management. I don't know how he managed. He's also working at Asca, a research and consultancy company. So very busy, and he will give us a presentation by IDDRI, a report on agroecological Europe in 2050, demonstrating that it is possible to have an agroecological Europe in 2050. So Xavier, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me well? And can you see my presentation as well? So Katerina, I can tell you I can't manage. So you have the answer to your question first. So thank you very much for inviting me. So I will then present very briefly the results of the 10 years for agroecology scenario, with a clear focus on the issue of today, which is the protein transition. So I'm struggling with my computer. So very briefly, 10 years for agroecology stands for a scenario based on an interdisciplinary research intervention approach. It is inspired by a lot of issues stemming from many cases in Europe I've been working on. So we tried to propose alternative narrative to the mainstream ones dominating the debate. So we have this overall multidisciplinary approach with three objectives. What are the conditions for large-scale agroecological for Europe with the time frame of 2050? And I think it echoes what Nick has said about the fact that things are moving and we cannot have fixed approaches. We wanted to develop plausible transition towards from present towards this future, and we wanted to feed our world, which is mainly academic and political debates dealing with the future of agriculture. So as said by Katerina, it was led by a think tank, IDDRI, and my company, Asca, and myself was deeply involved in this project. And I think one characteristic of TIFA is trying to combine figures and in order to give quantified answers to, for example, can agroecology feed Europe, and we're dealing at the European level, and also explaining more qualitative and narrative aspects of this debate. And clearly, we dealt with food system as a whole, not only the production size, but the whole food system. So it would be very frustrating because we have very strong time constraints, but I would just give you the flavor of TIFA. So why did we want to play on this? Because I think it's part of what has been said by the two first speakers. We are dominated by mainstream narratives. We say we need to produce a lot, we need to produce more. So for two reasons: for the status quo, saying we need to produce more in order to sustain our production, including the livestock production. I would say this is a Copa-Cogeca agenda. And there is also an agenda that we are seeing emerging. We need to produce a lot in order to have biomass for climate, and we need to change the livestock system, with notably the ruminants being the main targets for that. So these scenarios are fine on the paper, but they deal with they overcome a lot of aspects. Socioeconomics, I think that Maria said it just previously, this is leading to highly capital-intensive agriculture, so more tractors and less workers, in few words. On environment, which is my main focus, blind spot on pesticides, biodiversity, landscapes, and adaptation to climate change. You can try to win some chance of greenhouse gas, but you forget how to adapt to adverse climate. And in terms of food, and it has been said, we don't eat chemistry, we eat good food with meaning coming from a territory. So these are issues that these kind of approaches don't look at. I think this clearly goes in the line of the first two presentations. So we wanted to explore another scenario, and I want to maybe better and focus on the justification of this scenario, because this figure shows, I think you are familiar with this, the boundaries of the planets, the safe operating zone for the planets, and the dots show where agriculture plays a role. And we have two main domains where agriculture has to make progress. In few words, it's biodiversity, and this is fertility with the closing of biogeochemical flows. So this is, and what suggests this figure, this is utterly important, and I wouldn't say more important than climate, but the responsibility of agriculture is huge in this domain. So I like this figure that shows that we don't estimate at its importance, the importance of biodiversity collapse. We may win on a climate change agenda only focuses on emissions. If we don't have the life, if we don't have the ecosystems, at the end, we will have lost everything. So this is very important. And we want to rebalance a debate which is dominated by a climate change agenda. If we see to pretend transition, it leads to 100% vegetal at its end, as Nick has said, or a kind of poultry, which is much preferable than to pork and to ruminants. And at the end, it leads to animal intensification, the best option in order to spare land and to have a very efficient systems. And we wanted to explore another option, which is a scenario dealing with climate and biodiversity, because the first climate-oriented scenarios are completely ignoring the biodiversity issues. So what is TIFA's framing? You understand, I think it's strong sustainability approach. Biodiversity agrosystems are the basis for production and for human health as a whole. So this is we wanted to have something to say at the European scale, because we cannot have an agroecological transition without addressing what is taking place at this level, both between countries and between Europe and the rest of the world. At this present state, this is not satisfactory by far on this aspect. So we wanted to test the assumption, the hypothesis of agroecology as a plausible response for biodiversity, climate, etc. The quantitative model I already mentioned it. So just in order to identify the modeling where we were starting from and the analysis of the system, this is another way of saying, more technocratic, I may say, but this is another way of saying the Via Campesina vision and the system. So in present, 2/3 of the crops are used to feed animals. Nick mentioned 80%. If we had the pastures, it goes to the same figure. But 2/3 of the crops are used to feed animals. And this has led to the expanding animal production on industrial production patterns. So we all know the indoor and very intensive animal production. Less known figures, probably, the fact that imported soya represents nearly 20%, 1/5 of EU 27 agricultural area as a whole, which is huge, and which leads to another less known figure as well. The fact that Europe, as it is now, imports more calorie, is net importer of calorie. So when we have the narrative, Europe produces a lot, and needs to produce more in order to feed the world. As a matter of fact, this is exactly the opposite what is taking place. The world is feeding Europe, and more precisely is feeding industrial livestock factories. So this is clearly a complete change in in setting the agenda. And just to remind the impacts of such farming system on ecosystems, animal welfare, human health, and what I call farmer sociology and welfare. But this is exactly what has been said before. So we wanted to test a set of assumptions in order to quantify our things. So I go through them very, very quickly. The fertility management at the territorial level. So this is basically closing the cycles, not depending on imports from the rest of the world. Second, pesticide-free farming and extensification of crops production, clearly. And we had the organic farming as a reference model for this kind of, this part of the model. The redeployment of permanent grassland in the idea of mixed farming systems, which had been presented before, the livestock extensification and phasing out of industrial patterns, healthy and sustainable diets. I will elaborate a bit on this at the end, and then priorities in the use of land, food first, feed, biodiversity, and then if there is some production left for non-food, this is the last priority. So I can put it with pictures in order to make my speech more simple, if I may say. This is the kind of things we are thinking about, and if we have the protein issues, it comes from crop rotations, from permanent grassland and lake grassland, and it goes into all components of the system, and this diversity is part of the answer. So, of course, as many scenarios as we had of this kind, we had to. Our meaning was to say, sorry, we were saying that we cannot go with the status quo in terms of food consumption, diet and food consumption. So we had to change with halving as a whole dairy and meat products, and increasing the share of pulses, for example. And I think it's very important to make a zoom on the animal products part. So this is on the left, the present situation, which is what we have been setting as assumptions for agroecology and TIFA. And this is another reference scenario I will mention in my conclusion, which is a IPES-Food report. And we can see that clearly we have more meat from ruminants than the IPES-Food report, for example, simply because we are assuming that the extensification of ruminant herds leads to more meat produced per kilo of milk, more meat per kilo of milk produced. To put it very, very simply, if you have one cow producing 10 tons of milk per year, you will add one calf at the end. But if you have two cows able to value the extensive grassland, you will have two cows. So for the same amount of milk, you have more meat. So this is what is reflected in this scenario. And this is the, I would not say the price to pay, but this is the logical link with the conservation of biodiversity and permanent pastures. So what can we achieve with this scenario? First, if we compare, we have a drop in crop production by nearly a third, and by halving in livestock production. But then on this basis, we have a lot of benefits, much healthier and better food. We have biodiversity and soils at the core of the model in itself. We have good prospects for animal welfare because we reduce the amount of meat and milk that we need to produce, and we envisage much smaller farms at the end. We have positive impacts on climate and deforestation, and a food trade balance, which is that can be maintained as exporter and even improved because we don't import that much, and then we export. We can maintain, for example, a level export for cereals, for example. So clearly, the magical key for all these performances is halving the intake of animal product, because it reduces the needs for vegetal production and then the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides at the end. So clearly, we have been discussed on this aspect that this is not the scenario for huge biomass production, for biogas, for example, but this is another issue from our perspective. To say it in another words, I want to mention this paper that stating about circularity in animal production requires a change in the eat-lancet diet in Europe. This was the diet presented on the right in the diagram, and I would just focus on what is very clearly the rationale of TIFA. In particular, the eat-lancet guidelines recommend larger quantities of poultry meat over beef and pork, while a circular food system produces mainly milk, dairy, beef, and pork. Compared with the eat-lancet references, adopting such circularity will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a third and arable use by 42%. So this is exactly the same kind of reasoning that we have in TIFA. We are not alone in this kind of approaches. So to end my presentation, the key messages: the protected position is at the core of an agroecological food system, and we need this transition. And an actual, realistic, ambitious biodiversity conservation agenda. It requires a large extent of farming system, valuing extensive permanent grassland, and we speak about mixed system or pastoral systems. And then we need extensive ruminant system that can contribute to the whole protein balance at the end. So see the Nature Food paper. And this balanced food system is positive for biodiversity, natural resources, health, and climate. Thank you very much. These are the kind of publications we have been doing on TIFA, and I'm ready for your questions. I don't know how long I spoke, probably too long. But
perfect. No. We are in the time. And again, it was very necessary to have a scientific evidence that a shift, a transition towards agroecology is possible. So it was really useful what you said. I really encourage everyone to write their questions on the chat. In your TIFA scenario, there is a lot of discussions about fertilizers and reducing fossil fuel consumptions. In your TIFA scenario, you think Europe will be able to make this change? You said by 2050. You think it could be also earlier, or we will have to suffer largely for a long time?
I don't know. I don't have the crystal ball to answer your question. I think it takes time. It takes time, and I want to elaborate a bit on the meaning of 10 years for agroecology. It doesn't mean that we think that we can achieve the whole change of Europe towards agroecology in 10 years. What we are saying is that in 10 years, we can set the sociological and political basis for achieving this in one generation. This is the idea. So we know we have huge pressures on biodiversity and climate, and shifting towards this scenario would be a very, very positive signal in itself right now. And I would be rather pessimistic when we see the signals taking place right now towards the Green Deal, for example. But I would dream of achieving this sooner, but I think it's a question of long term. And I think it's very important to give time to farmers or to the whole food chain to anticipate that it has to completely reverse the whole logic of this. So this cannot be achieved like this. And the example of what took place in Sri Lanka, for example, is a good example of don't go too fast and don't just set rules that cannot be implemented.
Absolutely. We are not dreamers. We believe and we are working for this to happen very soon. So we think it is feasible. And I think from 3 perspectives, we have proved that we have the elements to do it. Now we have 20 minutes for a quick round of questions and the debate. I would like to start with one question, asking Morgan, then Nick, then Xavier to reply in 1 minute. And it's going back, some of the persons who are listening are still trying to understand what is the role of consumers. So are changes in diets sufficient to transition towards sustainability of our food systems? Can you reply 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, and then we make it, or you reply among you, and you can disagree. Please go ahead, Morgan.
I have strong doubts that the change that is required will go mainly through consumers changing their diets. Food and agriculture, it is about politics. It is very deeply about politics. You know that the reason why the carrots that you eat are orange, it's because the gardeners of Philippe Orange something, they decided to please their king to make it orange. Food is politics, really.
Thank you, Morgan.
And just one thing. One key element in this is that when the CAP was started, the Common Agricultural Policy was started in '62, one major decision was to make the importation of proteins to feed the animals free to enter the European market. And this has had a huge impact. This is the reason why now industrial livestock is in all coastal areas, while areas far away from the coast are either diverse farming or grain farming. So this decision has been the key for the specialization of European agriculture in the second part of the 20th century. So we really need to change these things to make sure that we support mixed farming and a lot of farmers. And these are really political decisions. So I think that the best thing that you can do as a consumer, of course, eat local, eat good, healthy, seasonal food, but also do politics or do ask for the elected people to change their politics. That is the most efficient way to go towards agroecology.
Super. What about Nick?
I really agree with what Morgan just said, and I think there's a big danger in putting all the responsibility on the shoulders of consumers because consumers have limited options. Some people have very limited options when they have low incomes and live in a place that doesn't have access to good, healthy, sustainable options. Consumers don't have all the information they would need on the true costs of food, so much of that is hidden away in these externalities, hidden costs. So consumer change has to be part of a much bigger change. And we shouldn't just put the emphasis on people switching one product for another. I think, as Morgan said, the bigger change is when people interact with food in a different way, and when they really challenge the options that they're facing, and they ask why the processed food is cheaper than whole foods. When they challenge the options they're getting in the shops, in their schools, in their neighborhoods. So people, individuals, citizens are part of the solution, but not just looking through this kind of consumer lens.
Super. Yeah, very important. What about Nick? What about, sorry, Xavier?
I'm afraid I will be on the same line. So I think exactly the same. I think that it's a way for governments to put all the responsibility on the consumers. And I would even that I think that the rationale behind this is to say consumers might have the right to choose between good or bad food at the end. So if we can, it's a logical of range. Can we say that? So you have products of different qualities which are offered to the consumers, and this means that we have the land will be managed accordingly. So you have some land which is for good, healthy production, and some land for unhealthy and bad production, environmentally adverse. So how can you manage this? This is not sustainable by any means. So I think we need to address this issue at the overall level of Europe with standards. We shouldn't have the right to eat polluted products by pesticides. We shouldn't have the right to eat meat which is produced in livestock factories not respecting animal welfare. So these are standards which need to be set at this level and imposed to all producers for the sake of both consumers and producers. The losers will be in between the food industries and retailers, but they need to change this power relation.
Interesting perspective. Not a label on organic agriculture, but a label on the one that is using a lot of pesticides and herbicides and raising livestock in an unsustainable manner. There are few questions, so let's be brief on your answers. I have another three. What would be the most efficient instrument to free European food eaters from this thinking they have to eat more proteins? What would you tell someone who thinks that for health problem, to keep young forever, they need to eat more protein? Would you start, Nick, and then Xavier, and then Morgan? Just a recommendation to a consumer.
I think the most important thing is to make people realize the different sources of proteins that they're already getting. If they're eating a good balanced diet, if it includes beans, pulses, legumes, a range of vegetables, and in addition, for some people, animal source foods, then they're going to be getting a good amount of protein. I think realizing that is important and showing people they can achieve that in a much cheaper way by eating a diverse whole food-based diet than by buying processed alternative proteins or by buying protein supplements being marketed by the health industry.
That's an excellent communication message. What about Xavier? What would you recommend?
Well, I'm not really an expert on this aspect, but I would insist more on the quality of the protein than on the amount. And to start with this aspect, I think it says something about the amount of protein we can produce as a whole. So I mean, we have a lot of protein which is ill produced with very adverse systems. So I would say eat good proteins and relax about this, and the rest will come.
Morgan?
I think it's always good to have a look at what our grandmothers were cooking, because our grandmothers, it was very rarely grandfathers, but what our grandmothers were cooking everywhere in the world was really rooted in what we could produce in a sustainable way. So most of the time, the very traditional dishes in every region, they represent what can be produced in a sustainable way. And most of the time, it's mainly grain with vegetal proteins, but with some part of meat, but in a very small quantities. If you look at most of the traditional dishes all over the world, this is the way it is most of the time. And I find it very inspiring because it has a lot of wisdom in it.
Sure, thanks a lot, Morgan. I have three questions, so I will ask one per each of you. One for Morgan was by Jose Luis Vicente, and he wanted to know what is the role of community-based organizations to support agroecological transition?
I think it's important. I work with a community-based a group of families, and I think it's important because as I was saying, you cannot really farm alone without a community around you. It's about the need that we have social needs as farmers, and we cannot be only alone in our farm. And it's also when very often in a farm, you have big problems and you need a community to come to the farm to help you. So it's not so much about ensuring a market, something very technical. It's really about having a lot of links with people who live around you, who can give you solutions, concretely people who work in different sectors. For me, it's very important. But once again, it's not a matter of a market. It's a matter of being part of a community where we support each other.
Yeah, support and solidarity again. The second question is from Alexander Betzel, and I would ask it to Xavier. And it's, there is a decrease in plant and animal production in the TIFA scenario. Will you speak about the overall food production and provision of calories and proteins?
Yes, it was measured with calories. And so I didn't make the equation for proteins, but this is, yes, this is measured with calories. But if I may, I want to make a comment about community agriculture. I think this is, we have to be aware, I think this is not be the alpha and omega and the whole organization of the food system. I discussed it with a breeder in Scotland, and he said, what is my community-based markets? I'm far away from any consuming area, so I need to trade my my beef, which is, I guess, in that cases was sustainably produced. So we have to think that in terms of organization and social organization, of course, community-based markets are very, very inspiring, and they should be developed at their maximum. But this cannot be the whole organization of the food system. We need sailors, we need retailers, we need industries in order to we are in a citizen, we are in a society which is urban, and we cannot ask people to live in the countryside, which is not realistic. So I think we have to think with this reality as well.
Thanks, Xavier. And there is also a question for Nick from James Williams. As you suggest, food politics is key part of transformative change to healthy and sustainable diets. How would you encourage ordinary citizens to engage and steer the political dialogue?
Thank you. Really good question. I think the most obvious and maybe kind of boring answer is just we need to be informed voters. We need to look at what political parties are saying about food systems and vote for those who are taking sustainable food systems seriously. However, that's not very motivating because we know that, you know, we're one of millions of voters, and unfortunately the political offering is not very good in that regard, and many parties and policymakers simply disregard food. So what we can do more concretely in our everyday lives, first of all, voting with the fork, that's part of the solution as well. But maybe even more important than that is trying to make change happen in the institutions and the places that we kind of live and work. So that could be, you know, being part of a school board and really trying to get the schools our children's go to serve more fresh organic food. It could be in the workplace, making sure that workplace, instead of having machines with chocolate bars, have fresh fruit baskets every day. So it becomes easier for people to consume a better diet. And those are just a couple of examples, but really there are sports venues that we live and work in where we're really a kind of a stakeholder. So I think there's a lot that we can do to change those environments that we're directly a part of, and that can be more effective and more motivating way to pursue change because you can see it happening more quickly.
Wow, lot of good ideas. Job creation for young people. Do you think agroecology can contribute to sustain job creation? In one, we have 3 minutes ahead. So you think this protein transition, the agroecology can support in concrete job creation for young people? Who wants to go first?
Well, I think Morgan will say a lot about this, but clearly, if we take the other way around, as industrial farming, this is destroying jobs, and when you are destroying jobs, you are destroying nature. Clearly, in order to have a sound management of countrysides and managing complex farming systems, you need more jobs, you need more brain, you need more cooperation. So clearly, this is conditions. This is not an opportunity. This is a condition for agroecology. The question is towards till where, how many farmers? And this is a more difficult question to address, but more farmers, this is clearly it. Is that a matter of millions or, I don't know, but the direction is clear.
Morgan, more farmers?
Yeah, in ECVC, we say that we want to double the number of farmers in Europe by 2040. And this is, in a way, it seems very ambitious, but if you see it in other things, it's not ambitious at all, or it's not enough. It would not be enough at all. So that's difficult. And I would not say a number. I think we need to say that we need many more farmers in Europe. That is important. I'm quite, I don't know, I'm quite puzzled about if it's good to create jobs for young people. Of course it is. But I think one of the issues that we have that we have to think about is, what do we work for? What do we want to produce? And what is useless to produce now in the society? And we are in a huge crisis. The biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis. I mean, it is a crisis it is a question of life or death for humanity, if you think of it in a longer term period. And right now that the issue of energy in Europe is so high, I think it's important to question ourselves, where do we want to put the energy that each of us has? And for me, putting our energy into producing healthy food and taking care of our ecosystem, it's very inspiring. And I say it for myself, because I really wanted to become a peasant in order to do this, in order to concretely not only doing webinars and and writing papers, you know, but concretely in my life, this is now what I do. And I see that what inspired myself, this is inspiring a lot of young people. I see a lot of young people who would love to do it, but we have to make it possible through fair revenues for farmers who do for farmers, and also through access to land, because right now it's very difficult to become a farmer in Europe. So we need to make sure that the people who are very inspired about taking care of the earth and of the others, they have the possibility to achieve their dreams.
Yeah. Nick, you started and you will have the final word of this seminar.
I'll be very brief. I think Xavier and Morgan give such great insights on this question. I would just make one point that we need to get the prices right. If we have fair food prices, then we can have fair revenues for farmers, and then we will have food systems in which we have more people working on the land as we need, and we have farmers able to stay in business rather than the current trend where we see this aging of the farming population and a very worrying decline in the number of farmers. So those big incentives need to be right, and then hopefully we would see that adjustment and more people able to enter this sector.
Thanks, Nick. As Jim Williams said, thank you very much for these very inspiring and good ideas. Beyond that, you shared your knowledge, your ideas, your heart with all of us. I think we are a community. And I think all together, joining our forces, I think we are engaged to make it happen. And I think we also learned a lot from each other. And on behalf of all the participants and on my personal behalf, thank you so much for this very, very nice webinar. Have a nice evening.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.